The night everything changed, Bryn Mitchell pressed her fingertips against her tired eyes and glanced at the clock glowing on her computer screen. midnight. Again, the fluorescent lights of the Portland Environmental Agency office buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the stacks of water quality reports covering her desk. Outside the window, rain tapped against the glass in that persistent Oregon way. Neither heavy nor light, just endlessly there. She saved her spreadsheet for the third time. A nervous habit she had picked up after losing 6 hours of work to a computer crash 2 years ago. The data didn't lie. Contamination levels in the Columbia River had increased by 12% over the past 18 months, and nobody seemed to care. Well, nobody except her. And what good did that do when she could barely speak up in meetings without her throat closing up? Her stomach growled, reminding her that a granola bar at 3 in the afternoon did not count as a real meal. Bryn grabbed her canvas jacket from the back of her chair and headed out into the misty Portland night. The streets were mostly empty, just a few cars splashing through puddles and the occasional person hurrying home under an umbrella. The Nighthawk diner sat on the corner of Morrison and 3rd, its neon sign flickering blue and pink against the wet pavement. Bryn had been coming here for late-night meals ever since she started working overtime 6 months ago. The owner, George, always had fresh coffee brewing, and the booths in the back were perfect for people who wanted to be left alone with their thoughts. She pushed through the glass door, shaking droplets from her hair. George waved from behind the counter, already reaching for a mug. Bryn smiled briefly and headed toward her usual spot in the back corner, sliding into the worn vinyl booth. She pulled out her phone, planning to review some notes while she waited for her food, when suddenly a crash erupted behind her. When cameras and chemistry, Calda Bryn spun around to see a man sprawled on the diner floor, surrounded by what looked like the contents of an entire camera bag. Lenses rolled in different directions. A tripod lay bent at an odd angle. Memory cards scattered like autumn leaves. The man scrambled to his knees, his brown hair falling into his eyes as he muttered a string of creative words under his breath. "Are you okay?" Bryn found herself asking, already halfway out of her booth. The man looked up, and Bryn felt something shift in her chest. His eyes were hazel, warm like honey in sunlight, and they crinkled at the corners despite his obvious frustration. He had the kind of face that looked like it smiled often, with small lines around his mouth that suggested laughter was a regular habit. "I'm fine, but my equipment might need therapy," he said, attempting a grin while gathering the nearest camera. "I swear I'm usually more coordinated. Tonight is just special." Bryn knelt down to help, carefully picking up a lens that had rolled near her feet. She handed it to him, noticing the calluses on his fingers and the small scar above his left eyebrow. "This looks expensive." "What happened?" "Tripped over my own ambition," he said, checking the lens for damage. "I was trying to carry everything in one trip because I'm apparently too stubborn to make two." Story of my life, really. Cole Harrison, professional filmmaker and amateur disaster. He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Bryn shook it. His grip was warm and firm. "Bryn Mitchell, professional worrier and amateur hermit." Cole laughed, a sound that seemed too bright for the dim diner at midnight. "Well, Bryn Mitchell, I apologize for interrupting your hermit time. Though I have to say, for a hermit, you have excellent reflexes." You caught that lens before it rolled under the booth. They gathered the rest of his equipment in comfortable silence, stacking it carefully in an empty booth. George brought over Bryn's usual order, a turkey sandwich and sweet potato fries, then raised an eyebrow at Cole. "Coffee, black, and whatever she's having," Cole said, gesturing to Bryn's plate. "If that's okay." "I'm starving, and that looks amazing." Bryn nodded, surprised at herself. Normally, she would have made an excuse and moved to a different table. She didn't do spontaneous conversations with strangers. She barely did planned conversations with people she knew. But something about Cole's genuine embarrassment and easy smile made her feel less guarded. Finding common ground in uncommon moments. "So what brings a professional filmmaker to a diner at midnight?" Bryn asked, picking up a fry. "Shouldn't you be at some glamorous event or editing bay?" Cole snorted, shaking his head. You've been watching too many movies about filmmakers. Most of us spend our time begging for funding and eating cheap food. I'm working on a documentary about river conservation, actually. Been filming interviews and collecting footage for about 8 months now. Tonight, I was at a community meeting about watershed protection. Paused, studying her with sudden interest. Wait, you're not by any chance the Bryn Mitchell who works for the environmental agency, are you? Bryn froze, her fry halfway to her mouth. How do you know that? Your name was on the report I read last week. The one about contamination increases in the Columbia River. It was incredibly detailed and it made me angry in the best way. The kind of angry that makes you want to do something. Cole leaned forward, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. That's exactly the kind of information my documentary needs. The real data, not just pretty shots of water. Heat crept up Bryn's neck. People rarely read her reports with that kind of attention. Most government officials skimmed them and filed them away. Those reports take months to compile. I check every testing site personally, cross-reference historical data, run multiple analyses. But nobody ever seems to act on them. It's because they're buried in bureaucracy, Cole said, his voice gentle but intense. People need to see the story behind the numbers. They need to understand why it matters. That's what I'm trying to do with this documentary. Show people the river as a living thing that needs protection, not just as a resource to exploit. Bryn found herself nodding, her usual reserve melting away. I collected samples from 15 different sites last month. The levels of agricultural runoff have increased so much that fish populations are declining. But when I try to present these findings in meetings, I just freeze up. My supervisor says I need to be more assertive, but it's like my voice just stops working when people are staring at me. Cole's expression softened with understanding. Public speaking isn't everyone's strength. But your work speaks volumes. Those reports are powerful, Bryn. They just need the right platform. The beginning of something unexpected, they talked for 2 more hours. Long after their food had disappeared and George had refilled their coffee 3 times, Cole told her about growing up in Seattle, how he had fallen in love with filmmaking after his grandfather gave him an old camcorder when he was 12. He described the documentary he was making, his vision for combining scientific data with human stories to create something that would actually make people care about environmental protection. Bryn, in turn, found herself sharing things she rarely told anyone. About how she had wanted to be a marine biologist as a child, spending summers at the Oregon coast collecting shells and studying tide pools. How her mother's death when she was 16 had made her retreat into herself, finding safety in numbers and data instead of people. How she loved her work, but hated feeling invisible in a system that seemed designed to ignore uncomfortable truths. You're not invisible, Cole said quietly when she finished. You're just in the wrong room. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. They just need someone willing to listen closely. When Bryn finally glanced at her phone, she was shocked to see it was nearly 3 a.m. I should go. I have to be back at work in 5 hours. Cole grimaced sympathetically. Same here. But before you leave, can I ask you something? Bryn tensed slightly, her guard starting to rise again. Maybe, would you be willing to meet with me next week? Not for anything formal, just to talk more about your research. I think there might be a way to collaborate, to get your findings in front of people who will actually care. He pulled out a business card, slightly bent from his earlier tumble. No pressure. I just think you have important things to say and I'd like to help people hear them. Bryn took the card, running her thumb over the embossed letters. Cole Harrison, documentary filmmaker. A website and phone number below. She looked up at him, at his hopeful expression and kind eyes, and made a decision that surprised herself. Okay, but just coffee. And somewhere with better lighting than this place, Cole's answering smile was bright enough to light up the entire diner. Deal? I know a great spot in the Pearl District. They have these cinnamon rolls that are basically life-changing. As Bryn walked home through the misty streets, Cole's business card tucked safely in her pocket. She felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not quite hope, but maybe its quieter cousin. Possibility. The rain had stopped. And above the city lights, a few stubborn stars pushed through the clouds. Bryn looked up at them and smiled. Coffee, cinnamon rolls, encouraged the Pearl District coffee shop Cole had mentioned turned out to be a cozy corner cafe called the Daily Grind, tucked between an art gallery and a vintage bookstore. Bryn arrived exactly on time, her anxiety manifesting as punctuality, and found Cole already waiting at a table by the window. He waved enthusiastically when he spotted her, nearly knocking over his water glass in the process. "I ordered us those cinnamon rolls I promised," he said as she sat down. "And I got you a latte because you seem like a latte person. But if I'm wrong, I can get you something else. I just didn't want to assume, but I also wanted to have something ready when you got here, so I kind of assumed anyway." Bryn felt her shoulders relax at his nervous rambling. It was oddly comforting to know she wasn't the only one feeling awkward. "A latte is perfect, actually." "How did you guess?" "Lucky instinct," Cole admitted with a sheepish grin. "Or maybe I just remember you adding a lot of cream to your coffee at the diner." The cinnamon rolls arrived, massive spirals of pastry dripping with icing, and for a few minutes they just ate in comfortable silence. Bryn watched the morning crowd pass by the window. People hurrying to work with their umbrellas and coffee cups, living their ordinary lives. When had her life become so small, she wondered. When had she started choosing safety over everything else? "So I did some research after we met," Cole said, pulling out a tablet. "I hope that's not creepy. I found several of your published reports online. Bryn, the work you're doing is extraordinary. The level of detail, the way you connect environmental factors to community health outcomes. It's exactly what people need to understand." Bryn felt her cheeks warm. "Most people find my reports boring. Too technical, too dense. My supervisor keeps telling me to simplify, to make them more accessible. But I don't know how to do that without losing the accuracy." "That's where storytelling comes in," Cole said, his eyes lighting up with that enthusiasm she had noticed at the diner. "Numbers tell one kind of truth, but stories tell another. What if we combined them? Your data with real human experiences? I've been interviewing families who live along the river, fishermen who've seen the changes firsthand, kids who swim in water they shouldn't. Their stories need your research to give them weight, and your research needs their stories to give it heart." "The documentary proposal?" Cole slid the tablet across the table, showing her a rough outline for his documentary. Bryn scanned the structure, impressed by how thoughtfully he had organized it. 3 acts, each focusing on a different aspect of river conservation: historical context, current crisis, and future solutions. He had left gaps in the second act, spaces labeled environmental data and expert analysis. "This is where you come in," Cole explained, pointing to the gaps. "I want to interview you, get you on camera talking about your findings, explaining what the numbers actually mean. And I'd love to film you doing your work. Collecting samples, running tests, the whole process. People need to see the science happening, not just hear about it after the fact." Bryn's immediate instinct was to refuse. The idea of being on camera, of having people watch her and judge her, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But she looked at Cole's hopeful expression, at the careful planning he had already done, and she thought about those contamination levels that kept rising while bureaucrats filed her reports away. "I'm not good on camera," she said quietly. "I told you, I freeze up when people are watching me." "I'll ruin your documentary." "You won't," Cole said with unexpected certainty, "because you won't be performing. You'll just be doing what you already do every day, talking about something you care about. And if you freeze up, we stop, we take a break, we try again. No pressure. No judgment. Just you and me having a conversation about saving a river." Bryn bit her lip, torn between terror and temptation. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Okay, but we start small. Just a short interview, and if it's terrible, we stop. Deal." "Deal," Cole agreed, extending his hand across the table. They shook on it, and Bryn felt that same warmth from their first handshake, like touching sunlight behind the camera. Beyond the fear, the following Saturday, Bryn met Cole at one of her regular testing sites along the Columbia River. The morning was crisp and clear, one of those rare Pacific Northwest days when the sun actually made an appearance. Cole had brought a smaller camera setup, just one camera on a tripod and a simple microphone. "We'll keep this casual," he promised, adjusting the camera angle. "I'm just going to ask you questions about your work, and you answer however feels natural. Forget the camera is there. Just talk to me like we're having coffee again. Bryn took a deep breath and nodded. She could do this. Maybe the first few minutes were painful. Bryn stumbled over her words, forgot what she was saying mid-sentence, and kept glancing nervously at the camera. But Cole was patient, asking gentle questions and actually listening to her answers. Gradually, Bryn found herself relaxing. When Cole asked her to explain how she collected water samples, she forgot about the camera entirely, focusing instead on showing him the proper technique. This is called a Niskin bottle, she explained, holding up the cylindrical device. You lower it to a specific depth, then trigger it remotely to collect a sample. It's important to test at multiple depths because contamination levels can vary dramatically. Surface water might look clean while deeper layers are full of pollutants. And what are you testing for specifically? Cole asked, his voice coming from behind the camera. Bryn waded into the shallows, her rubber boots splashing softly. Agricultural runoff primarily. Pesticides, fertilizers, nitrogen compounds, but also industrial waste, microplastics, and bacterial contamination. The river is basically receiving pollution from every direction, and it's reaching critical levels in some areas. She demonstrated the collection process, explaining each step with growing confidence. When she looked up, she caught Cole smiling at her behind the camera. And she realized with surprise that she had been talking for 15 minutes straight without hesitation. That was perfect, Cole said, stopping the recording. See? You're a natural when you're passionate about something. Finding her voice at the community center over the next few weeks, Bryn and Cole fell into an easy rhythm. They met 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes for filming, sometimes just to plan the documentary, and sometimes for no reason except they enjoyed each other's company. Cole introduced her to his favorite taco truck. Bryn showed him the hidden hiking trails where she went to clear her head. They texted random thoughts at odd hours and had long phone conversations about nothing important. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Cole invited Bryn to join him at the Riverside Community Center, a modest building that served the neighborhoods most affected by river pollution. When they arrived, Bryn was surprised to find Cole immediately surrounded by children, all clamoring for his attention. Mr. Cole, are you filming today? A little girl with braids asked, tugging on his jacket. Today. Jade, but I brought someone special I want you to meet. Cole gestured to Bryn. This is Miss Bryn. She's a scientist who studies the river and makes sure it's safe. Jade's eyes widened. Like a superhero? Bryn laughed, caught off guard by the description. Not exactly. I just test the water and write reports. That sounds boring, declared a boy named Marcus, crossing his arms. Marcus? That's rude, Cole chided gently. Miss Bryn's work is actually really important. Why don't you let her explain? Suddenly, Bryn found herself sitting on the floor surrounded by 8 curious children, all waiting to hear about her supposedly boring job. She glanced at Cole, who gave her an encouraging nod and took a breath. Okay, so imagine the river is like a giant bathtub, Bryn began, using her hands to illustrate. When you take a bath, the water starts out clean, right? But then you get in with your dirty hands and muddy feet, and maybe you drop your toy boat that had chocolate on it. Suddenly the water isn't so clean anymore. That's kind of what's happening to our river. Lots of people and factories are putting dirty things in the water. And my job is to check how dirty it's getting and tell people we need to clean it up. But how do you check? Jade asked. Leaning forward intently, Bryn spent the next 30 minutes explaining water testing in terms the children could understand, drawing pictures and answering their endless questions. She talked about pH levels using lemon juice and baking soda as examples. She explained bacteria using the concept of tiny, invisible germs. She made them laugh by describing the time she fell into the river while collecting samples and came up covered in mud. When the session ended and the children were called away for snack time, Bryn felt energized rather than drained. Cole was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. You were amazing, Cole said simply. Those kids hung on your every word, and you didn't freeze up once. You just talked from your heart. Bryn looked down at her hands, overwhelmed by the realization. I guess I forgot to be scared. I was too busy trying to make them understand. Exactly, Cole said softly. That's the secret. When you stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about the message, the fear loses its power. The story she'd never told that evening. Cole and Bryn sat on a bench overlooking the river as the sun set in streaks of orange and pink. They had picked up Thai food and were eating straight from the containers, watching boats drift by in the fading light. "Can I ask you something personal?" Cole said, setting down his pad thai. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Bryn tensed slightly but nodded. "Okay. What made you so afraid of speaking up? You're brilliant, and you clearly care deeply about your work. But there's something that holds you back. I've seen it in meetings, the way you shrink into yourself when someone asks for your opinion." Bryn was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow past. She had never told anyone the full story, not even Ruby, her best friend. But sitting here with Cole, with the sky turning dark and the city lights beginning to twinkle, she found herself wanting to share. "When I was in graduate school, I presented my thesis research at a conference," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was about pollution patterns in the Willamette River. I had spent 2 years collecting data, running analyses, building models. I was so proud of the work." She paused, gathering courage. But during the question and answer session, one of the senior professors in my field stood up and tore my research apart. He said my methodology was flawed, my conclusions were overstated, and my recommendations were naive. He did it in front of 200 people, and he was so confident, so dismissive, that others started piling on. By the end, I was shaking so hard I could barely stand. Cole's hand found hers on the bench, warm and steady. The worst part was finding out later that he had financial ties to the companies my research implicated. Bryn continued, tears stinging her eyes. "He wasn't critiquing my science. He was protecting his investments. But the damage was done. My advisor suggested I soften my findings. Other students started avoiding me. I felt like I had been marked as someone who didn't belong, who didn't know what she was talking about. So I learned to stay quiet, to keep my head down, to let my reports speak for themselves because I couldn't trust my own voice anymore." "Bryn," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion, "that professor was wrong. And more than that, he was dishonest. Your research threatened his wallet, so he tried to silence you. But that says everything about him and nothing about you or your work." "I know that intellectually," Bryn admitted, "but knowing something and feeling it are different things. Every time I try to speak up now, I hear his voice telling me I'm wrong, that I'm naive, that nobody wants to hear what I have to say." Cole turned to face her fully, his hazel eyes intense in the dimming light. "Then we need to give you a new voice to hear, your own voice. The one I heard today with those kids, the one I see in your reports, the one that knows the truth and refuses to back down from it. That voice matters, Bryn, and I want to help the world hear it, if you'll let me." Bryn looked at him at the genuine care in his expression and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, but blooming. Like a seed that had been buried too long, finally pushing through the soil towards sunlight. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it. Let's make this documentary mean something." Cole smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "We already are." They sat together as night fell completely over Portland, the river flowing endlessly beside them. Carrying away the old hurts and making space for something new. When Truth Meets Resistance 3, months into filming, the documentary was taking powerful shape. Cole had gathered incredible footage of families affected by river contamination. Children with unexplained illnesses, fishermen watching their livelihoods disappear. And threaded throughout was Bryn's careful scientific analysis, giving weight and credibility to their stories. She had become comfortable on camera, her passion for the subject overriding her anxiety. But success brought new challenges. Preston Walsh, a journalist who worked at the same production company as Cole, had been watching the project with growing interest. Preston had a reputation for sensational environmental exposes, the kind that won awards, but sometimes played fast and loose with facts for dramatic effect. One morning, Cole arrived at Bryn's office looking troubled. "We need to talk." Preston approached the production company with a proposal to take over the documentary. He wants to reframe it, make it more controversial, Add allegations we can't prove yet. Bryn felt ice slide down her spine. What kind of allegations? He wants to directly accuse specific companies of deliberately poisoning the river. Name executives, imply criminal conspiracy. The problem is we don't have evidence for that level of accusation. We have data showing contamination and circumstantial evidence of negligence, but not intentional malice. Preston doesn't care. He says controversy sells, and that's what will get people's attention. But that's not honest journalism, Bryn protested. If we make claims we can't back up, we destroy our credibility, and then the real issues get buried under lawsuits and denials. Cole nodded, running a hand through his hair in frustration. I know, but the production company is considering his proposal. They think his name recognition could help the documentary reach a wider audience. I have a meeting with them tomorrow, and I need to decide whether to fight to keep control or let Preston take over. Bryn stood up, pacing her small office. This was exactly the kind of situation that normally made her want to hide, to let someone else handle the confrontation. But she thought about those children at the community center, about Jade asking if she was a superhero, about all the families counting on this documentary to finally bring attention to their suffering. Fight, she said firmly. We do this the right way, or we don't do it at all. I'll come with you to the meeting. I'll show them the data, explain why Preston's approach would backfire. They need to hear it from the scientist, not just the filmmaker. Cole looked at her with surprise and admiration. Are you sure? That meeting is going to have 10 people in the room, including Preston. He's going to challenge everything you say. Bryn felt her old fear rising, but pushed it down. Then let him challenge. I have the truth on my side. And maybe it's time I stopped letting bullies win. Standing up and speaking out, the production company conference room was sleek and modern. All glass walls and expensive furniture. Bryn sat next to Cole, her laptop open in front of her, trying to ignore the way her hands wanted to shake. Across the table, Preston leaned back in his chair with easy confidence, already acting like the project was his. The meeting started with Preston presenting his vision. He was charismatic and persuasive, painting a picture of a hard-hitting expose that would make national headlines. He threw around terms like environmental justice and corporate accountability while describing dramatic confrontations and damning accusations. The problem with Cole's approach is that it's too soft, Preston concluded. Too much time on science and not enough on villains. People don't care about parts per million. They care about evil corporations and poisoned children. We give them that story, and this documentary becomes a movement. Several people around the table nodded thoughtfully. Bryn saw Cole's jaw tighten. Can I respond to that? Bryn heard herself say, her voice steadier than she expected. Preston turned to her with a patronizing smile. Of course. You're the scientist, right? Cole's been telling everyone how important your data is. I am the scientist, Bryn confirmed, opening her laptop. And I've spent 3 years collecting the data that forms the foundation of this documentary. So let me be clear about something. The contamination in the Columbia River is real, it's serious, and it's getting worse. But it's not the result of some mustache-twirling villain deliberately poisoning people. She pulled up a series of charts and graphs, projecting them on the conference room screen. What we're dealing with is systemic failure. Agricultural runoff from farms that use pesticides approved by the EPA, industrial discharge that meets current legal limits but still accumulates to dangerous levels, aging infrastructure that allows sewage overflows. These are problems of neglect, inadequate regulation, and prioritizing profit over environmental protection. That's still damning. That's still worthy of outrage. But it's factual, Preston interrupted. But people don't want to hear about systemic failure. That's abstract and boring. They want someone to blame. Then we show them the people who are responsible, Bryn countered, her voice growing stronger. The legislators who voted against updated environmental protections, the corporate boards who lobbied to weaken regulations, the agency officials who ignored warning signs. We name names based on public records and documented actions. That's powerful, and it's defensible. If we make accusations we can't prove, we give those same people ammunition to discredit everything else we're saying. She clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of her research alongside news articles. 3 years ago, I published a report predicting exactly the contamination levels we're seeing now. Nobody paid attention because it was buried in bureaucratic language. This documentary is our chance to make people finally pay attention, but only if they trust us. And they won't trust us if we're making sensational claims that fall apart under scrutiny. The room was silent. Bryn could feel her heart pounding, but she forced herself to continue. Those families Cole has been filming, those children getting sick. They deserve better than to be used as props in a sensational story that prioritizes drama over truth. They deserve a documentary that will hold up in court, that will force real policy changes, that will actually protect the river instead of just getting good ratings. She sat back down, suddenly exhausted. Cole reached over and squeezed her hand under the table. The production company director, a woman named Jennifer Kane, studied Bryn thoughtfully. "That was quite a presentation, Miss Mitchell. Preston, do you have a response?" Preston's confident smile had faded slightly. "I think Miss Mitchell is being naive about how media works in the modern landscape. Facts don't matter as much as narrative. Emotion beats data every time," maybe Jennifer said slowly. "But lawsuits also beat ratings. And I'm inclined to trust the scientist who's been working on this issue for 3 years over the journalist who started paying attention 3 weeks ago. Cole, the project stays yours. Make it powerful, but make it true." It's victory and vulnerability after the meeting. Cole and Bryn walked along the river in silence for a while, both still processing what had happened. Finally, Cole stopped and turned to face her. "You were incredible in there," he said. "I've never seen you so fierce." Preston didn't know what hit him. Bryn laughed shakily. "I was terrified. But I kept thinking about what you said about forgetting myself and focusing on the message. Those families are counting on us. I couldn't let them down just because I was scared." "You found your voice," Cole said softly. "Not just in that meeting, but throughout this whole project. You've transformed from someone who couldn't speak up in meetings to someone who just took down Preston Walsh in front of a room full of executives. Do you see that?" Bryn looked out at the river, watching the current flow steadily past. "I had help. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. You created a space where it felt safe to be brave." Cole stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Bryn, I need to tell you something. This stopped being just about the documentary for me a long time ago. Somewhere between midnight cinnamon rolls and teaching kids about pH levels, I fell for you, completely. And if that makes things weird or complicated, I'm sorry, but I can't keep pretending it's not true." Bryn's breath caught. She looked up at him, at his honest eyes and hopeful expression, and felt the last of her walls crumble. "It's not weird. It's not complicated. It's perfect." Their kiss was soft and sweet, tasting of coffee and promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "So what happens now?" Bryn asked. "Now we finish the documentary," Cole said. "We tell the truth, we demand change, and we do it together." The presentation that changed everything 6 weeks later. The documentary premiered at a special screening for Portland City Council members, environmental officials, and community leaders. Bryn sat in the packed auditorium, Cole's hand warm in hers. Watching 3 years of her life and 3 months of their work unfold on the screen, the documentary was powerful. It opened with Cole's footage of the river at dawn, beautiful and serene, before pulling back to reveal the contamination invisible to the naked eye. Bryn's voice explained the science in clear, accessible terms. Families shared their stories. Children drew pictures of the healthy river they wished they had. Data visualizations showed the progression of pollution over decades, but the most impactful moment came near the end. Cole had filmed Bryn presenting her findings to the city council 1 month earlier. A formal hearing where officials were required to listen to public testimony. The old Bryn would have read a prepared statement in a shaking voice and sat down. But this Bryn stood tall, made eye contact, and spoke with passion about the urgent need for action. "The data is clear," her voice rang out from the screen. "We have a narrow window to prevent irreversible damage to the Columbia River ecosystem. But that window is closing. Every month we delay implementing stricter regulations. Every session where we prioritize economic concerns over environmental protection, we are choosing profit over people. Over children, over the future. I'm asking you today, not as a bureaucrat filing another report, but as someone who loves this river and this city. Please choose differently. Please choose our children's health over corporate convenience. Please choose to act before it's too late. The film ended with current footage of community members, including many of the children from Riverside Community Center, cleaning up riverbanks and monitoring water quality. A message appeared on screen. Change starts with truth. What will you do with it? The lights came up, and the auditorium erupted in applause. Bryn felt tears streaming down her face. Cole pulled her close, whispering in her ear, "You did it. You changed the conversation." 1 year later, standing by the river, the documentary had sparked real change. New regulations were passed. Funding was allocated for infrastructure improvements. Several companies were facing investigations. The river wasn't clean yet, but the trajectory had shifted from decline to recovery. Bryn stood on the same riverbank where she had first filmed with Cole, watching the sunset paint the water gold and pink. She was wearing her favorite sundress, and Ruby had insisted on doing her hair that morning, though she wouldn't say why. Cole appeared on the path, carrying something in his hands. When he reached her, Bryn saw it was a small box. "A year ago," Cole said, "I met a brilliant, beautiful woman who had convinced herself she had to be invisible to be safe. I watched her discover that she's neither invisible nor silent, that when she speaks, people listen, that her voice has the power to heal rivers and change policies and inspire children." He knelt down on one knee, opening the box to reveal a simple silver ring with a small aquamarine stone. "Bryn Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you keep speaking truth to power with me? Will you help me tell more stories that matter and raise kids who care about rivers and build a life that's as brave and honest as you've become?" Bryn laughed through her tears, pulling Cole to his feet. "Yes, to all of it, yes." They kissed as the river flowed behind them, steady and eternal, carrying away the past and bringing in the future. Around them, the Oregon twilight settled soft and purple, wrapping them in quiet promise. 6 months after that, Bryn stood at a podium at the Pacific Northwest Environmental Conference, addressing 300 people. She wore a suit and her wedding ring and spoke without notes about the importance of scientist activism and public communication. In the audience, Cole filmed her, documenting this moment for their own archives, his face glowing with pride. When the speech ended and people rushed forward to ask questions and share their own stories, Bryn caught Cole's eye across the room. He grinned and gave her a thumbs up. She smiled back, remembering the terrified woman who once couldn't speak at all, and felt grateful for every step that had brought her here. She had found her voice, and the world was listening.